I wanted a lake cabin. Simple as that. But every single property I looked at came with strings attached. HOA fees. HOA rules. HOA meetings. HOA presidents telling you what color you could paint your dock. I didn't want any of that. I wanted freedom. I wanted to own property without someone else controlling it. So when I found a cabin that sat just outside the HOA boundaries, I jumped on it. The real estate agent warned me that the HOA neighbors might not be thrilled. She said they preferred everyone in the area to be part of their community. I didn't care. The property was beautiful. The price was right. And most importantly, it was mine. No HOA. No rules. No fees. The HOA president showed up 3 days after I moved in. She was friendly enough at first. She welcomed me to the area. Then she handed me a packet of information about joining the HOA. She said most people in my position chose to join voluntarily. She said it made things easier for everyone. I politely declined. Her smile disappeared. That's when the harassment started. Letters about my property choices. Complaints about my dock. Pressure from neighbors. They wanted me to fall in line. They wanted me to join their little kingdom. They had no idea what I discovered in my property deed. They had no idea that the only road into their entire community ran across my land. They had no idea I owned their only way in and out. And they were about to find out what happens when you push someone who holds all the leverage. I'd been searching for lakefront property for almost a year. Not just any property. I wanted something specific. Privacy. Natural shoreline. A cabin with character. And absolutely no homeowners association. That last requirement eliminated most of what was available. Lake properties are expensive. Developers know people will pay premium prices for water access. And developers love HOAs because HOAs protect property values and maintain standards. So almost every lakefront community built in the last 30 years came with mandatory HOA membership. Beautiful properties. Reasonable prices. But all of them required joining an HOA and following their rules. I kept searching. I worked with a real estate agent who understood what I wanted. She knew I was serious about avoiding HOAs. She knew I'd rather pay more for an independent property than get a deal on something that came with restrictions. So she kept looking for properties that predated the HOA developments. Properties that had been grandfathered in when the HOAs formed around them. Then she called me about a cabin that had just hit the market. It was older. Built in the 1970s. It sat on about 2 acres of wooded land with direct lake access. The cabin itself needed some work, but the bones were solid. The location was interesting. It sat adjacent to a large HOA community called Lakeview Estates. But the property itself wasn't part of the HOA. It had been established decades before the HOA existed. I drove out to see it immediately. The property was exactly what I'd been looking for. The cabin had that vintage lake house feel. Wood paneling. Stone fireplace. Large windows overlooking the water. The lot was heavily wooded, which meant privacy from neighbors. The shoreline was natural rock and sand. No manufactured beach. No concrete seawall. Just natural beauty. I asked the agent about the HOA situation. She confirmed that this property was not part of Lakeview Estates HOA. When the HOA had been formed in the 1990s, this parcel had been specifically excluded because it was already privately owned. The current owners had lived here for 20 years without HOA involvement. They'd never paid fees. They'd never attended meetings. They'd never been subject to HOA rules. The asking price was fair. Not cheap, but fair for lakefront property with this much privacy. I made an offer the same day. The owners accepted. We moved to closing quickly. Within 6 weeks, I owned the cabin. The closing process included a thorough title review. I read through every document carefully. The property deed, the survey maps, the historical records. I wanted to understand exactly what I was buying. I wanted to make sure there were no surprises. No hidden easements. No restrictions I hadn't been told about. The title was clean. No liens. No encumbrances. No HOA obligations anywhere in the documentation. The property boundaries were clearly defined. I own 2 acres including significant lake frontage. The survey showed my property bordered the Lakeview Estates community on one side but remained completely independent from it. I moved in during early summer. I spent the first few weeks just settling in. Unpacking. Making small repairs. Getting to know the property. Walking the boundaries. Exploring the shoreline. It was everything I'd wanted. Peaceful. Private. Beautiful. And completely mine to do with as I pleased. The lake itself was shared water. Public access. But my shoreline and dock were private. I could use the lake however I wanted without asking anyone's permission. I could paint my dock whatever color I liked. I could keep whatever boats I wanted. I could landscape my shoreline naturally instead of maintaining some HOA mandated aesthetic. The freedom was exactly what I'd been searching for. And then the HOA president showed up at my door. Her name was Sandra Mitchell. She was the president of Lakeview Estates HOA and she arrived at my door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself warmly enough. She brought a welcome basket with some local products and a bottle of wine. She seemed friendly on the surface. But I could sense something underneath the friendliness. An agenda. A purpose beyond just welcoming a new neighbor. We sat on my porch and talked for a while. She told me about the community. About the HOA's history. About the events and activities they organized. About the maintenance standards they maintained. She made it all sound very appealing. Very organized. Very professional. She talked about how the HOA kept property values high. How they maintained the roads and common areas. How they created a sense of community that made lake living special. Then she mentioned the welcome packet she'd brought. Along with the local products and wine was a folder of documents. HOA membership information. Application forms. Fee schedules. She slid the folder across the porch table toward me with that fixed smile. She said most people in my position chose to join voluntarily. She said it was better for everyone when the whole lake community operated under the same standards. I picked up the folder and looked through it briefly. The annual HOA fees were substantial. The rules and restrictions were extensive. Architectural guidelines. Landscaping requirements. Dock specifications. Paint color approvals. Noise restrictions. The document was comprehensive and controlling. I set it down and told her I wasn't interested in joining. Her smile flickered. Just slightly. She said she understood that I wasn't legally required to join. She acknowledged that my property was outside HOA boundaries. But she strongly encouraged me to reconsider. She said the community worked better when everyone participated. She said non-members sometimes created friction with HOA residents when property standards differed. She was politely threatening that my refusal to join would create problems. I told her again that I wasn't going to join. I told her I'd bought this property specifically because it was independent. I told her I intended to enjoy that independence. She left with her smile intact but her eyes were cold. The letters started arriving within 2 weeks. Formal HOA communication citing concerns about my property. My dock didn't match the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. My landscaping wasn't maintained to community standards. My outdoor lighting was too bright. The letters were written as though I were an HOA member subject to their rules. As though my refusal to join didn't change my obligations. I responded to each letter with a simple statement. I was not an HOA member. I was not subject to HOA rules. Their guidelines didn't apply to my property. My responses were polite but clear. The letters kept coming. Then the visit started. HOA board members showing up to discuss my property choices. Neighbors stopping by to express concerns about how my property looked. The pressure was coordinated and persistent. They were trying to wear me down. They were trying to make non-membership so uncomfortable that I'd eventually join just to make the harassment stop. I consulted with a property lawyer at this point. I wanted professional confirmation that my position was correct. The lawyer reviewed my deed and the HOA documents. He confirmed clearly that I had no obligation to the HOA. My property was independent. Their rules didn't apply. Their enforcement mechanisms didn't extend to my land. Armed with that legal confirmation, I sent a formal letter to the HOA board. I told them that any further attempts to apply HOA standards to my property would be considered harassment. I told them to stop sending communication citing rules that didn't apply to me. They didn't stop. The harassment escalated after my formal letter. I'd expected it to slow them down. I'd expected that a clear legal statement of my independence would make them reconsider their approach. But Sandra Mitchell wasn't the kind of person who backed down easily. She was the kind of person who viewed resistance as a challenge. My refusal to comply had become personal for her. She organized what I can only describe as a pressure campaign. She got HOA residents to file complaints with the county about my property. Noise complaints. Complaints about my dock structure. Complaints about my landscaping. Most of these complaints were frivolous and went nowhere. County officials would investigate, find nothing genuinely wrong, and close the complaint. But each investigation required my time and attention. Each visit from a county inspector was an interruption. Each complaint filing was a small harassment designed to accumulate into something overwhelming. She also organized the community socially against me. HOA residents who'd been friendly in casual encounters became cold. People who'd waved when passing on the water stopped acknowledging me. I'd hear conversation stop when I walked past at the marina. The social pressure was subtle but consistent. They were trying to make me feel unwelcome. They were trying to make life at the lake unpleasant enough that I'd either join the HOA or sell and leave. Some HOA residents actually approached me individually and apologized. They said they disagreed with Sandra's approach. They said they thought my property rights should be respected. But they didn't want to publicly challenge the HOA president. The social dynamics of a tight community meant that opposing Sandra had costs. So they stayed quiet publicly while privately expressing sympathy. The pettiest incidents were the most revealing. Someone reported my boat to the marina for an alleged registration violation. The registration was completely current. The report was baseless. Someone else complained to the county about my septic system. An inspector came out, found everything properly installed and functioning, and left. Someone filed a noise complaint about a gathering I hosted that ended before 9 in the evening. Each incident individually was minor. Together they formed a pattern of coordinated harassment designed to make my life difficult. Sandra Mitchell was using the HOA's collective resources to bully a single independent property owner into submission. And she was getting away with it because nothing she did was quite over the line. Each individual action was defensible. The cumulative effect was harassment, but proving that legally was complicated. I documented everything. Every letter. Every county complaint. Every inspector visit. Every incident where I could identify HOA involvement. I was building a record. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it, but I knew documentation was protection. And then I started doing something that changed everything. I started looking more carefully at my property documents. Not just reading them. Really studying them. I pulled out the original survey maps. I looked at the historical records from when my property was established in the 1970s. I compared the old maps to current maps. I looked at road designations. I looked at access points. I looked at property lines and how they related to the surrounding community. I found something that made me put the papers down and sit quietly for a long moment. Something that recontextualized everything. Something that explained why my property had been priced the way it was. Something that suggested the previous owners had either not known what they had or had deliberately chosen not to use it. I needed to call my lawyer immediately. Because what I was looking at, if accurate, changed every single thing about my situation with the Lakeview Estates HOA. The survey map showed a road. A private road. Running from the main county road through my property and into the Lakeview Estates community. The road designation was clear. Private access road. And according to the property boundaries shown on the survey, that road sat entirely on my land. I checked the deed next. The deed referenced the road specifically. It was described as part of the property parcel. Not a public right-of-way. Not a dedicated road. A private road on private property. My private property. I pulled up satellite imagery on my computer and compared it to the survey maps. The road was clearly visible. It was the main entrance to the Lakeview Estates community. The paved road that dozens of HOA residents used every day to access their homes. The only practical vehicle access into their entire development. And it ran across my land. I called my lawyer immediately. I explained what I'd found in the property documents. I asked him to verify whether I was reading this correctly. He asked me to send him copies of the survey and deed. He said he'd review them carefully and get back to me. He called back 3 hours later. His voice had a certain tone to it. The tone lawyers get when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. He confirmed what I'd suspected. I owned the access road into Lakeview Estates. The entire road from where it left the county road to where it entered the HOA community sat on my property. I asked the obvious question. What about easements? Surely the HOA had a recorded easement granting them permanent access rights. My lawyer had already researched this. He'd checked the county records. There was no recorded easement. No formal access agreement. No legal right-of-way granted to the HOA or to individual property owners in Lakeview Estates. He explained what had apparently happened. When the Lakeview Estates development was planned in the 1990s, the developers had approached my property's previous owners about purchasing a strip of land for road access. Or about establishing a formal easement. The previous owners had apparently declined to sell but had given informal permission for the road to be built across their property. A handshake deal. Neighborly permission. But nothing formally recorded. Nothing legally binding on future property owners. The developers had apparently proceeded anyway. They'd built the road. They'd marketed and sold properties based on access via that road. They'd created an entire community that depended on access they didn't legally own. Maybe they'd assumed they could formalize the easement later. Maybe they'd assumed the informal permission was sufficient. Maybe they'd planned to deal with it eventually and had just never gotten around to it. Whatever the reason, here we were 25 years later. An HOA community of 40 homes depended entirely on a road they didn't own. They had no alternative access. The geography didn't allow it. The lake was on one side. Protected wetlands were on another side. My property bordered the third side with the road. The fourth side was landlocked by other properties. There was literally no other practical way for vehicles to enter or exit Lakeview Estates. I asked my lawyer what this meant legally. He was very clear. I owned the road. I controlled access. I could grant permission or deny it. I could charge for access if I chose. I could close the road entirely if I had legal cause. The previous owner's informal permission didn't bind me. I was under no obligation to continue allowing access without a formal agreement. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a long time. Sandra Mitchell had been harassing me for months. She'd weaponized the HOA against me. She'd organized complaints and social pressure. She'd tried to bully me into submission. And the entire time, I'd owned the only road her community could use. I sat on that information for a week. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't make any moves. I just watched. I watched HOA residents drive past my property twice a day using the road I owned. I watched Sandra Mitchell drive that road to and from her house inside the community. I watched county vehicles use it to service the HOA properties. I watched delivery trucks, mail carriers. Every single vehicle accessing Lakeview Estates crossed my land. And the harassment continued. Another county complaint arrived. This time about alleged storm water runoff from my property. The inspector came, found nothing improper, and left with an annoyed expression. He could tell these complaints were harassment. But he had to investigate each one. Then came the incident that made my decision for me. I'd had a dock section repaired. The contractor had parked his truck on my property near the water while doing the work. Sandra Mitchell walked onto my land without permission, photographed the truck, and filed a complaint with the county about commercial vehicles on residential property. The complaint was baseless. Contractors are allowed to park while working. But it required another county visit. Another investigation. Another disruption to my life. When the county inspector left, I called my lawyer. I told him I wanted to restrict access to the road. I asked him to walk me through exactly what I could legally do. He explained that as the property owner, I had every right to control access to my private road. I could install a gate. I could post signs. I could require permission for access. I could charge fees. I could restrict access entirely if I chose to. He recommended giving the HOA notice before taking action. Notify them that I was asserting ownership of the road and that access would be controlled going forward. This would give them an opportunity to negotiate an easement before I took any physical steps to restrict access. I considered that advice. I really did. But I decided against it. Sandra Mitchell had spent months harassing me without warning. Without consideration. Without respect. She'd filed complaints without notice. She'd organized social pressure without conversation. She'd treated my property and my rights as obstacles to be overcome rather than as legitimate boundaries to be respected. So I decided to give her the same courtesy she'd given me. None. I hired a contractor to install a gate across the road. A substantial metal gate. The kind used on farm properties. Heavy duty. Lockable. Permanent. The contractor positioned it precisely on my property line at the point where the road crossed from county property onto my land. I had him install concrete posts on either side. I had him install clear signage. Private property. No trespassing. Access by permission only. The work was completed on a Wednesday afternoon. By Wednesday evening, the gate was locked and the road was closed. The only access into Lakeview Estates was blocked. My phone started ringing within an hour. HOA residents who'd been out during the day returned to find they couldn't get home. They called each other. They called Sandra Mitchell. They called me. I didn't answer. I let every call go to voicemail. The voicemails were a mix of confusion, anger, and panic. People demanding I open the gate immediately. People threatening legal action. People claiming I couldn't do this. People asking what was happening. The messages piled up through the evening. Then the police arrived. Someone from the HOA had called them claiming a public road was being illegally blocked. 2 officers arrived at my property that evening. They were professional and courteous. They explained that they'd received a report about a public road being blocked. I invited them to my porch and showed them my property documents. The survey map. The deed. The ownership record showing the road was private property on my land. The officers examined the documents carefully. They called their supervisor. They verified the information against county records on their mobile system. After about 20 minutes, they confirmed that this was indeed a private road on private property. I had every legal right to control access to it. There was no crime being committed. There was nothing they could do. One officer asked if I understood that closing this road would prevent people from accessing their homes. I told him I understood completely. I told him those same people had spent months harassing me. I told him I documented every complaint, every county visit, every incident of HOA organized pressure. He nodded slowly. He said this was a civil matter between property owners. He suggested we work it out among ourselves. After the police left, Sandra Mitchell called. I answered this time. She was furious. She demanded I open the gate immediately. She said people couldn't get to their homes. She said this was illegal. She said emergency vehicles couldn't access the community. She was yelling before I could get a word in. I waited until she paused for breath. Then I spoke calmly. I told her the road was my private property. I told her I'd verified my legal rights with both my lawyer and the police. I told her that access was no longer automatic. I told her we'd need to negotiate a formal access agreement. She threatened to sue. She said the HOA would take me to court for blocking a road that had been used for decades. She said they'd claim prescriptive easement or adverse possession. She said they'd claim necessity. She was throwing out every legal theory she could think of. I told her to have her lawyers call my lawyer. I gave her my lawyer's contact information. Then I ended the call. The next 24 hours were chaotic for Lakeview Estates. Residents couldn't drive to their homes. Some had parked at a nearby shopping center and walked in through the woods. Some had arranged to stay with friends or family elsewhere. Some were stuck outside the community with no way to retrieve belongings or check on their properties. The local news picked up the story. Reporters called me for comment. I declined to speak with them. The HOA held an emergency board meeting that Thursday morning. I know this because my phone started ringing again Thursday afternoon. This time it was the entire HOA board requesting an immediate meeting. Their tone had changed significantly. The demands were gone. The threats were muted. They wanted to negotiate. I agreed to meet with them that evening. At my cabin. On my terms. The entire board showed up. Sandra Mitchell. The vice president. The treasurer. The secretary. 2 at-large board members. They sat on my porch where Sandra had sat months earlier with her welcome basket and her pressure to join the HOA. The conversation started with Sandra trying to maintain some authority. She said the HOA needed immediate access restored while we negotiated a long-term solution. I said no. I said we'd negotiate the agreement first. Then I'd open the gate. Not before. The negotiation took 3 hours. I had a list of terms prepared. My lawyer had helped me develop them. They were fair but firm. And they were non-negotiable. First, a formal recorded easement granting Lakeview Estates HOA access across my property. The easement would be specific and limited. It would grant access for residents, guests, service providers, and emergency vehicles. It would not grant unlimited use. It would not transfer ownership of any portion of the road. It would be revocable if terms were violated. Second, the HOA would pay for the easement. An upfront payment covering the value of the access being granted. Then annual maintenance fees for the privilege of using my property. The fees would be substantial enough to reflect the actual value of what they were receiving. Third, the HOA would be responsible for all road maintenance. Repairs. Snow removal. Repaving when needed. I owned the road, but they'd maintain it as a condition of using it. Any damage caused by HOA-related traffic would be their responsibility to repair. Fourth, a formal written apology from the HOA board acknowledging the months of harassment. Acknowledgement that they'd attempted to apply HOA rules to property outside their jurisdiction. Acknowledgement that their actions had been inappropriate. This wasn't about money. This was about respect and accountability. Fifth, a permanent end to all harassment. No more county complaints about my property. No more attempts to pressure me into joining the HOA. No more social campaigns against me. My property choices would be respected as completely independent from HOA standards. Sandra Mitchell tried to negotiate. She said the fees I was proposing were excessive. She said the HOA couldn't afford both an upfront payment and annual fees. She said the maintenance responsibility was unreasonable. She was trying to find some angle where the HOA maintained leverage. I told her the terms weren't negotiable. I told her she could accept them or the gate would stay closed. I reminded her that I had no obligation to grant access at all. I reminded her that the HOA's current situation was entirely the result of their developers' failure to secure proper legal access decades ago. That wasn't my problem. It was theirs. The board members looked at each other. The treasurer asked how they'd pay for this. Sandra said they'd have to assess every HOA member. A special assessment to cover the upfront payment. Then increased monthly fees to cover the annual costs. The HOA members weren't going to be happy about it. I stayed quiet. Their internal problems weren't my concern. I waited. The vice president was the first to break. He said they should accept the terms. He said they had no alternative. He said the community needed access restored immediately. He looked directly at Sandra when he said this. There was tension in that look. Blame. She'd created this situation with her harassment campaign and now the HOA was paying the price. Sandra tried once more. She asked if I'd consider joining the HOA in exchange for reduced fees. She was still trying to win. Still trying to bring me under HOA control. I almost laughed. I told her absolutely not. The terms stood as presented. The board voted 4-1 to accept my terms. Sandra was the only no vote. She'd been outvoted by her own board. My lawyer drafted the formal easement agreement. It took 2 days to finalize the language. The HOA had their lawyer review it. Both sides signed. The document was recorded with the county. The upfront payment cleared into my account. On Monday morning, exactly 5 days after I'd closed it, I opened the gate. The gate opened and Lakeview Estates residents flooded back into their community. The relief was visible. People had been staying with relatives or friends. They'd been unable to access their homes properly for 5 days. Some had work-from-home setups they couldn't use. Some had pets being cared for by neighbors who'd walked in through the woods. The disruption had been significant and the entire community knew exactly why it had happened. The formal easement was recorded with the county. It was a public document now. Anyone could look it up and see that Lakeview Estates HOA paid for access across my property. The upfront payment had been $50,000. The annual fee was $5,000. These weren't arbitrary numbers. My lawyer had researched comparable easement values and market rates for this kind of access arrangement. The fees were fair compensation for the value the HOA was receiving. The special assessment to cover the upfront payment hit every HOA household. Each household paid over $1,000. The monthly HOA fees increased to cover the annual easement cost. Residents who'd been part of Sandra Mitchell's harassment campaign were now paying directly for the consequences of that campaign. Some understood the connection. Others just complained about the fees without understanding their role in creating the situation. The harassment stopped completely. No more county complaints about my property. No more visits from inspectors. No more organized social pressure. The easement agreement included specific language prohibiting HOA interference with my property. Violation of that clause would result in access revocation. The HOA board understood that threatening my property rights now meant threatening their own access. The incentive structure had reversed entirely. Sandra Mitchell resigned as HOA president within a month. The board didn't force her out publicly. But the pressure from HOA members was intense. She'd created an expensive problem through her personal vendetta against a non-member. Her leadership had cost every household over $1,000 in special assessments plus increased monthly fees. The board accepted her resignation and elected a new president who was notably more diplomatic. The new HOA president reached out to me personally. He apologized for the previous board's approach. He said the new board wanted a positive relationship with neighboring properties. He asked if there was anything the HOA could do to improve relations. I appreciated the gesture. I told him the best thing the HOA could do was respect boundaries and leave my property alone. He agreed completely. Community dynamics shifted in interesting ways. Some HOA residents who'd participated in the harassment campaign avoided me entirely now. Others approached me individually to apologize. They said they'd gone along with Sandra's campaign without fully understanding the situation. They said they realized now that I'd been in the right. The social isolation that had been organized against me evaporated. People waved again when passing on the water. Conversations at the marina were friendly. The financial benefit of the easement was substantial. $5,000 annually was meaningful income from property I already owned. The upfront payment had covered my legal fees and the gate installation with money left over. The road maintenance responsibility meant I'd never pay for repaving or repair. The HOA was responsible for keeping the road in good condition. My property value increased as well. Having a formal recorded easement providing HOA community access was actually valuable. It meant the road had permanent legal status and couldn't be challenged. Future buyers would see that income stream and maintenance arrangement as assets. Most importantly, I had peace. The lake cabin I'd bought for independence and privacy was finally delivering both.